what are the ramifications for this halakha regarding the Jewish education system in general? What is one to do? Very often, teenagers, for example, who are in educational institutions, clearly are half off the derech, not acting properly. So, does this imply we have to just kick them out? What does this imply?
You ask a very, very good and intelligent question. What I just said a moment ago is true, that things have changed. But equally true, perhaps even more so, is what you are saying, that things have changed in the other direction. And or that which one has to bear in mind when one considers the point you are raising. In other words, if we were to live by this standard, then many educational institutions would need to be shut down. Or we could at least limit the number of institutions, because there would be many fewer students who would be considered hachunim, who would be considered worthy and proper to whom to teach Torah. And we know what would happen if such a system of Jewish education, the various systems that exist, each with its own faults and blemishes, but we all know what would happen if all those were simply shut down. Particularly in this would be true both in Chutz La'aretz, both overseas, in which case such a child would end up going to some public school or non-Jewish private school. And we know exactly where that would lead. So we're talking here about pikuach nefesh, quite literally in every sense. And it's also true in Eretz Yisrael today. Many people, many children, many young people, youth would find themselves on the street, either figuratively or literally in some cases, but certainly figuratively. They would find themselves removed from any positive influence, and the general surrounding influence is a very negative one, and this has to be avoided at all costs. So essentially what I'm saying is that is two things. First of all, this halakha, as formulated by Hazal, as quoted here by Rambam, was not speaking about a degenerate world, a world full of negative influences. Not that negative influences not exist in the past. They did. No question about it. A Jew living within the Greco-Roman world, shall we say, when these halachot were at least formally formulated for the first time, was surrounded by avodah zarah and all manner of bestiality and shefichut damim, etc., etc. We all know what the Roman world was like, for example. But you did not have the internet, despite what we just said. You do not have the internet. You do not have a world which has truly run off its rails, off its rocker, to the extent that the main topic for discussion in many parts of the Western world today is what is a woman, for example. If I had said to you 20 years ago, this would be one of the most hotly debated topics in the Western world. This would be the issue that people would invest all their energies and intellect in debating what is a woman. You probably would have thought that I'm off Morocco, but we see that this is reality. It's difficult to believe that this is reality, but it is. Excuse me. So that being the case, we have to know that if we were to refuse to educate Jewish children, Jewish teenagers out there, and by the way, it's not just children and teenagers, it's true for young adults and older people as well. If we were to refuse to teach Torah to many people for this reason, as we see here, that the person has to be first harun, in other words, he basically has to be a Yehudi kasher before you begin teaching him Torah, you would be condemning huge numbers of people to spiritual destruction. And this, of course, would lead to tremendous increased levels of assimilation, which, of course, is terribly high and destructive as things stand. So that's one thing we're saying. Why things on the one hand have changed in the time of Chazal, and in fact, in many ways, are worse, and we must take this into account. Second of all, here we're discussing general education. In other words, children have to go to school. So the question is where they're going to go to school, who's going to teach them. If you don't teach them, someone else is going to teach them. It might be another kind of religious school, so-called, which is much more wishy-washy than your school, shall we say. And it might be someone fresh out of a woke joke university who is going to inculcate in these people the most recent iteration of their insanity. So again, you have to save people from these outcomes and these eventualities. In other words, we're talking about just trying to create a decent, basically decent, normal Jew against all the attempts and all the influences that exist, which mitigate to result in the opposite. I'm aware of a certain Rav in a certain town, a certain city in Chutz La'aretz, where he had established many years before, he had established a community and a school system for that community, which was quite successful. And the various institutions that he had established over the years were now facing a terrible financial crisis. And essentially the bank was telling this person, we cannot continue giving you credit and what have you, you're going to have to shut down, or you're going to have to pay up. We cannot do this any further. And I heard this from someone who witnessed this. He went with one of his followers or minions. He went to the bank manager, and he tried to explain to this non-Jewish bank manager what it is that they actually do in these institutions. And he was a very heated and easily excited individual, and he began speaking, throwing his hands around and speaking in a very heated and energetic manner. And he said, "Do you know what we do in our schools?" He says, "We create mention." And then he tried to explain the term mensch to this person, to this bank manager. In other words, we are talking about as a basic minimum to try and create a mensch as opposed to a disaster. So basically almost anything is mutar in order to prevent total disaster and create at minimum a mensch, which is untranslatable, but basically means a decent, normal Jewish human being. When Chazal said these words, they were not referring to all the things that we just mentioned. They were referring to teaching Torah. The assumption was that a Jewish child or young person, or an adult for that matter, would be living in an environment, a Jewish community, where there were basic norms and standards, and you did not have to accept every person into your yeshiva. And we're not talking here about children, by the way. Also, it's clear we're not talking about young children. A young child is usually, it's not relevant, it's not possible or necessary to discuss whether they are harun or not harun. A 6-year-old child is a 6-year-old child. He's basically a blank sheet of paper, and he will become what you make of him. And that's exactly what we were saying before. And therefore, you have to make something of him, not somebody else. So we're not talking about a young child who has to be taught how to read and to say Kriyat Shema and how to read the Pasuk Torah, Siwalanu Moshe, etc., etc. We're not discussing that. We're discussing a person who's a bit older, let's say from post-Bar Mitzvah age onwards, who wants to come to the Beit Midrash to learn. Not everybody comes to the Beit Midrash, and not everyone has the inclination or the capability or what have you. And then you are justified in trying to ascertain who this person is before you instruct him in Torah beyond the very basic level perhaps that he has achieved already from his childhood. But as a child, every child is considered tam. In other words, he needs to be educated, and this is what we discussed before. In the previous perek, we discussed how it is a chovah for every Jewish community to teach Torah to the children.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.